In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a shocking murder rocks Miss Jane Marple's quiet world. When Reverend Clement is found stabbed in a locked church vestry, the kind-hearted detective uncovers a web of secrets. A hidden letter, a mysterious fingerprint, and a chipped cup that point to a killer hiding in plain sight. As her faith wavers, Miss Marple digs deeper, revealing a truth that shakes the village. The Reverend's own wife, driven by shame and desperation, is the murderer. Join Miss Marple's gripping journey to solve the crime, restore her faith, and heal a broken community in this thrilling tale of mystery and redemption. Chapter 1. The Quiet Village. The sun peeked over the hills, painting St. Mary Mead in soft gold. It was spring, and the village hummed with life. Birds chirped, flowers bloomed, and the air smelled of fresh grass. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cozy parlor, her favorite spot in her neat little cottage. The room was warm, filled with sunlight that slipped through lace curtains, making pretty patterns on the walls. Her knitting needles clicked softly, shaping a pink shawl. She loved these quiet mornings, where nothing seemed to stir but her thoughts. Her cottage sat on the edge of the village, a small place with a tidy garden. Roses climbed the walls, and a stone path led to the front door. Inside, everything was in its place. A cushioned armchair by the fire, a bookshelf stuffed with novels and gardening guides, and a teapot on the table ready for her next cup. Miss Marple, with her white hair tied in a bun and her sharp blue eyes, looked like any old lady. But her mind was quick, always picking up details others missed. She'd lived in St. Mary Mead her whole life, and she knew its people, their habits, their secrets, their hearts. St. Mary Mead was a sleepy place, the kind where everyone knew everyone. The village green had a duck pond where children played, and the high street boasted a bakery, a butcher, and a post office that doubled as a gossip hub. The church, with its old stone tower, stood at the heart of it all. Reverend Clement led the services there, his kind voice filling the pews with hope. Miss Marple liked him. He was a good man, always ready with a smile or a word of comfort. His sermons made her feel the world wasn't such a bad place after all. This morning, though, something felt off. Miss Marple couldn't put her finger on it. Maybe it was the way the birds stopped singing for a moment, or the faint chill that crept through the open window. She paused her knitting, her needles still, and listened. The village was too quiet, like it was holding its breath. She shook her head, telling herself it was just her imagination. Old ladies, she thought with a smile, always make mountains out of molehills. Then came the knock. It was sharp, urgent, not the polite tap of a neighbor dropping by for tea. Mrs. Marple set her knitting on the table and smoothed her skirt. She opened the door to find Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, standing there. Her face was white as chalk, her eyes wide with fear. Her bonnet was crooked, and her hands twisted together like she didn't know what to do with them. "Miss Marple!" Mrs. Price's voice shook. "It's awful, just awful. Reverend Clement, he's dead. Found in the church, murdered," Tighter. Word hit Miss Marple like a cold wind. Murdered? Reverend Clement? It didn't make sense. Her mind spun, but her face stayed calm. She'd learned long ago to keep her feelings tucked away when trouble came knocking. "Come in, dear," she said gently, guiding Mrs. Price to a chair. "Sit down and tell me everything." Mrs. Price sank into the armchair, her breath coming in gasps. Miss Marple poured her a cup of tea from the pot, adding a spoonful of sugar. "Drink this," she said. "It'll steady you." Mrs. Price took the cup with trembling hands. "I went to the church early," she began, her voice low. "I was bringing flowers for the altar. Daffodils, his favorite. The vestry door was shut, but I heard a thump, like something heavy fell. I knocked, but no one answered. I thought maybe he was praying, so I waited. But it was so quiet, Miss Marple. Too quiet. I pushed the door, and it wasn't locked. And there he was." Her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "There he was, dear. What did... You see? Mrs. Price swallowed hard. He was at his desk, slumped over. There was blood, oh, so much blood. A letter opener was in his chest, right through his heart. I screamed and ran to fetch Mr. Hargreaves, the church warden. He called the police. Miss Marple's mind raced. A letter opener? In the vestry? It was such a personal thing, not a weapon you'd carry unless you meant to use it. She pictured the vestry, a small room behind the altar, cluttered with books and papers. Reverend Clement often worked there, writing sermons or meeting parishioners. It was a private place, not somewhere you'd expect a murder. Did you see anyone else? At the church? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Price shook her head. No one. The village was still waking up. I didn't even see Tommy Pierce, the choir boy, and he's usually there early, sweeping the steps. Miss Marple nodded, storing the detail away. Tommy was a lively boy, always in trouble for something, stealing apples or skipping chores. But he wasn't a killer, surely. And the police? She asked. They're there now, Mrs. Price said. Inspector Craddock from Scotland Yard. He's asking questions, looking at everything. Oh, Miss Marple, who would do such a thing? Reverend Clement was so kind, so good. Miss Marple patted her hand. I don't know, dear, but we'll find out. Now you rest here. I'm going to the church. Mrs. Price looked shocked. You? But it's a crime scene. The police won't let you. Miss Marple smiled, a small, determined smile. Inspector Craddock and I have met before. He'll let me have a look. Besides, I knew Reverend Clement. If there's anything to notice, I'll notice it. She fetched her coat and hat, a sensible black one with a single feather. Her walking stick leaned by the door, but she left it behind. Her steps were steady as she walked down the stone path, Mrs. Price trailing behind, still clutching her tea. The village was waking now, and heads turned as they passed. Mrs. Dane at the bakery waved, then stopped, her face falling as she saw Mrs. Price's expression. Word would spread fast, Miss Marple knew. By noon, every house in St. Mary Mead would be buzzing. The church stood at the end of the lane, its tower casting a long shadow. Police wagons were parked outside, and a small crowd had gathered, villagers whispering, their faces tight with worry. Miss Marple recognized a few. Mr. Hargreaves, the church warden, looking grim. Miss Lavinia Gray, a spinster who never missed a service, and young Tommy Pierce hovering at the edge, his cap twisted in his hands. Inspector Craddock stood by the church door, tall and serious in his dark coat. His hair was graying at the temples, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He'd worked with Miss Marple before, on cases that stumped even the best detectives. He respected her, though he'd never admitted outright. Miss Marple, he said, tipping his hat, I might have known you'd turn up. Inspector, she replied, her voice polite but firm. I heard about Reverend Clement. May I see the vestry? Craddock raised an eyebrow. It's a murder scene, ma'am. Not exactly a place for an old lady? She finished, her eyes twinkling. I won't touch anything, Inspector. I just want to understand what happened to my friend. He sighed, then nodded. All right, but stay back, and don't disturb the evidence. Miss Marple followed him through the church, her shoes soft on the stone floor. The pews were empty, but the air felt heavy, like the building itself was mourning. The vestry door was ajar, guarded, by a young constable who stepped aside at Craddock's nod. The vestry was just as she remembered, a small, cozy room with a wooden desk, a bookshelf, and a narrow window. Reverend Clement's chair was pushed back, and he lay slumped over the desk, his head resting on a pile of papers. The letter opener was still in his chest, its silver handle gleaming in the dim light. Blood had soaked his white collar and pooled, on the desk, dark and sticky. Miss Marple's heart ached, but she kept her face steady. Craddock flipped open his notebook. No signs of a fight, he said. The door was locked from the inside, and the key was in his pocket. The window's latched, and there's no other way in. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Miss Marple stepped closer, careful not to touch anything. Her eyes moved over the room, taking in every detail. The desk held an open Bible, its pages marked with a ribbon. A half-written sermon lay beside it, the ink still wet. A cup of tea sat cold, untouched, with a faint ring of sugar at the bottom. She leaned in, noticing something odd, a smudge on the window pane, barely visible in the light. "Inspector," she said quietly, "have you looked at this window?" Craddock frowned and joined her. The smudge was small, shaped like the tip of a finger. Miss Marple took her handkerchief and dusted it lightly, revealing a clearer print. "It might be nothing," she said, "but fingerprints don't lie." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Good catch, ma'am. I'll have it checked. But it could be old. This place isn't cleaned often." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, but her mind was already turning. A locked door, a latched window, a single fingerprint. It was a puzzle, and she loved puzzles. She looked at Reverend Clement's face, peaceful even in death. "Who hurt you, dear friend?" she whispered. Craddock cleared his throat. "We're questioning the villagers. Anyone with a grudge, anyone who was near the church. Got any thoughts, Miss Marple?" She tilted her head, thinking of the village and its people. Mr. Hargreaves, who'd argued with the Reverend over money for the organ. Miss Gray, who'd been upset when her ideas for the church fete were ignored. Tommy Pierce, caught stealing, from the collection plate. None of them seemed like killers, but she'd learned long ago that evil could hide in the kindest faces. "Not yet, Inspector," she said, "but I'll keep my eyes open." Craddock nodded, scribbling in his notebook. "I know you will. Just don't get in the way." Miss Marple smiled. "I wouldn't dream of it." She left the vestry, her heart heavy but her mind alive with questions. The village wasn't so quiet anymore. Somewhere out there was a killer, and she'd find them. For Reverend Clement, for St. Mary Mead, and for the faith that still burned in her heart even now. As she stepped into the sunlight, the church bell tolled, a slow, sad sound. Miss Marple straightened her hat and walked back to her cottage, ready to unravel the mystery that had shattered her peaceful morning. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The Church of St. Mary Mead stood like a silent giant, its stone walls cool under the morning sun. Miss Jane Marple walked through the arched doorway, her steps soft but sure. The air inside was heavy with the scent of old wood and candle wax, and the quiet felt wrong, like the building knew its heart had been broken. Reverend Clement's murder had shaken the village, and Miss Marple's sharp mind was already piecing together the puzzle. Inspector Craddock led her past the empty pews, their polished surfaces catching slants of light from the stained glass. Windows. The colors, red, blue, gold, spilled across the stone floor, but today they seemed dull, as if mourning. The vestry door was just beyond the altar, a plain wooden slab with a brass handle. A young constable stood guard, his face pale, and his hands fidgeting. He stepped aside as Craddock nodded, and Miss Marple followed the inspector into the small room where death had come calling. The vestry was cramped, no bigger than her parlor back home. A wooden desk sat against one wall, piled with papers and books. A single chair, cushioned but worn, was pushed back from the desk. A narrow window let in a sliver of light, its latch rusted but closed tight. Shelves lined the walls, stuffed with hymnals, sermon notes, and a few dusty trinkets. A brass cross, a chipped teacup, a framed photo of the church from years ago. The air smelled faintly of ink and old paper, but something sharper cut through, the metallic tang of blood. Reverend Clement lay slumped over the desk, his head resting on a stack of papers. His white clerical collar was stained red, and a letter opener jutted from his chest, its silver handle catching the light. The blood had pooled beneath him, dark and thick, soaking into the wood. His face, even in death, looked peaceful, almost kind, as if he hadn't seen the blow coming. Miss Marple's heart twisted, but she kept her expression steady. She'd seen death before, though it never got easier. Inspector Craddock stood beside her, his notebook open, his pencil scratching. As he spoke, "No signs of a struggle," he said, his voice low. The door was locked from the inside, and the key was in his pocket. Windows latched, no other way in or out. Whoever did this was quick and clever. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes moving over the room like a hawk's. She didn't touch anything. Craddock would have scolded her for that, but she didn't need to. Her mind was her tool, sharp as any knife. She stepped closer to the desk, careful to keep her skirts clear of the blood. The letter opener was an odd choice for a weapon, she thought. It wasn't something you'd carry unless you meant to use. Had the killer brought it, or was it already here, lying on the desk, waiting? She looked at the papers under Reverend Clement's head. A half-written sermon peeked out, the ink smudged but readable. Forgiveness is our duty, even when the heart rebels. The words trailed off, as if he'd been interrupted. Beside it was an open Bible, its pages marked with a red ribbon. The verse was from Matthew, one about turning the other cheek. Miss Marple's lips tightened. Had the Reverend been thinking of someone specific when he chose that passage? A cup of tea sat on the desk, cold now, with a faint ring of sugar at the bottom. She leaned closer, noticing a tiny chip on the rim. Odd, she thought. Reverend Clement was tidy, not the sort to use a damaged cup. She filed the detail away, her mind already spinning with possibilities. Inspector, she said, her voice soft but clear. Have you checked the window? Craddock glanced up from his notebook. The window. It's latched, Miss Marple. No one could have climbed through without breaking it. She stepped to the narrow window, her eyes catching the smudge she'd noticed earlier. It was faint, barely a shadow on the glass, but it looked like the tip of a finger. She took her handkerchief, a delicate square of lace, and dusted the smudge lightly. The print became clearer, a partial curve with faint ridges. A fingerprint, she said, turning to Craddock. It might mean nothing, but it's worth a look. Craddock's eyebrows shot up. Good eye, ma'am. I'll have it dusted properly, but it could be old. This room's not exactly scrubbed daily. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, but she wasn't so sure. The smudge looked fresh, the edges sharp, not blurred by time or dust. She examined the latch, rusted but sturdy. It was closed, but when she pressed it gently with her handkerchief, it gave a little. Loose, she thought. Someone could have opened it, slipped through, and latched it again from inside. But why? And how? She turned back to the desk, her gaze falling on a small ink bottle, its cap off and a tiny spill staining the wood. The pen lay beside it, its nib wet, as if Reverend Clement had been writing just before he died. She pictured him sitting there, working on his sermon, maybe sipping his tea. Then what? A knock at the door? A shadow at the window? Someone he knew, someone he trusted, stepping into the room with a smile and a hidden blade. Craddock was watching her. His pencil paused. You've got that look, Miss Marple, he said. What's on your mind? She smiled, a small, polite smile. Just thinking, Inspector. A locked room is a tricky thing. It makes you wonder what the killer wanted us to believe. He grunted, jotting something down. We're checking everyone who was near the church this morning. Mrs. Price, who found him. Mr. Hargreaves, who came running when she screamed. A few others who were up early. Anyone with a reason to hurt the Reverend. Miss Marple's mind flicked to the village and its people. Mr. Hargreaves, the church warden, was a gruff man, always fussing about money. He'd argued with Reverend Clement last month over funds for the organ, his voice loud enough to carry across the green. Then there was Miss Lavinia Gray, a spinster who lived for the church. She'd been upset when the Reverend politely turned down her plan to run the church fete single-handed, and Tommy Pierce, the choir boy, who'd been caught slipping coins from the collection plate. None of them seemed like murderers, but Miss Marple knew better than to judge by appearances. The kindest faces could hide the darkest hearts. She stepped back, letting Craddock's men do their work. They were dusting for prints, measuring the room, taking photos with a bulky camera that flashed like lightning. One of them, a young man with freckles, was sketching the scene, his pencil moving fast. Miss Marple watched him for a moment, noting how he captured the angle of the letter opener, the slump of the Reverend's shoulders. Details mattered, she thought. They always did. Her eyes drifted to the bookshelf, where a small wooden box caught her attention. It was plain, no bigger than a cigar case with a simple latch. She didn't touch it. Craddock would have had her head, but she leaned closer. A faint scratch marked the lid, as if someone had pried it open. "Inspector," she said, pointing. "What's in that box?" Craddock followed her gaze. "Haven't checked it yet. Probably just church odds and ends. Keys, maybe, or old receipts." "Could you open it?" she asked, her voice mild but firm. He sighed but signaled to the freckled officer, who pulled on gloves and lifted the box. The latch clicked, and the lid swung open. Inside was a single item, a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. Craddock unfolded it carefully, revealing a list of names in the Reverend's neat handwriting. Some were crossed out, others underlined. Miss Marple recognized a few, villagers, most still living, but one name stood out, Lavinia Gray, circled in red ink. "What's this?" Craddock muttered, turning the paper over. Nothing was written on the back. Miss Marple's mind raced. A list? A record of debts, sins, or something else? Why had the Reverend kept it hidden? And why was Miss Gray's name marked so boldly? She didn't say anything, but her thoughts were buzzing like bees. Craddock slipped the paper into an evidence bag. "We'll look into this. Could be nothing, could be everything." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes returning to the desk. She noticed a faint mark on the floor, a scuff near the chair, as if something heavy had been dragged. It was small, barely noticeable, but it didn't fit. The vestry was tidy, the Reverend meticulous. A scuff like that meant movement, maybe a struggle, though Craddock had said there was none. "Inspector," she said, pointing to the mark. "What do you make of that?" He crouched, squinting at the floor. "Could be from the chair. Or maybe someone bumped something. We'll check it." She didn't press him. Craddock was thorough, but he worked by rules, and rules could miss the human side of things. Miss Marple's strength was seeing people, how they acted, what they hid. She thought of Reverend Clement, his kind eyes and gentle voice. He'd been troubled lately, she remembered. At last Sunday's service, his sermon had faltered, his words heavy with something unspoken. Had he known danger was coming? Had he seen the shadow behind the smile? She stepped to the window again, her fingers brushing the latch through her handkerchief. The view outside showed the churchyard, its gravestones mossy and tilted. Beyond it was the village green, where children were playing, their laughter faint. Through the glass. Life went on, even when death struck. But for Miss Marple, the world felt a little darker today. Craddock was giving orders now, his men packing up their tools. "We're done here for now," he said. "Body's going to the coroner. We'll know more once they check for poison. Or other wounds." Miss Marple nodded, though she doubted poison. The letter opener was too deliberate, too personal. This wasn't a distant killing. It was close, intimate, born of anger or fear. She looked at Reverend Clement one last time, her heart aching. "Rest well, dear friend," she whispered. "I'll find who did this." As she left the vestry, the constable closed the door behind her. The church felt colder now, its silence deeper. She walked through the nave, her shoes echoing on the stone. Outside, the crowd had grown, villagers whispering, their faces tight with shock. She saw Mr. Hargreaves talking to a policeman, his hands waving. Miss Gray stood alone, clutching her prayer book, her lips moving silently. Tommy Pierce was gone, probably scared off by the police. Craddock caught up with her at the church door. "You'll let me know if you hear anything, Miss Marple? Village talk, anything odd?" "Of course, Inspector," she said, her smile polite. "And you'll tell me about that fingerprint?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't miss a trick, do you? All right, I'll keep you posted." She walked back to her cottage, the sun warm on her face but her thoughts cold. The vestry was a locked room, a puzzle with too many pieces missing. The fingerprint, the scuff, the list, the chipped cup, they all meant something, but what? And why had Reverend Clement died? Was it money, pride, or a secret too heavy to bear? By the time she reached her garden, her mind was set. She'd sit. With her knitting tonight, let the village talk and listen. St. Mary Mead was small, but its secrets were big. Somewhere, someone was hiding the truth, and Miss Marple would find it, one quiet step at a time. Chapter 3. The Village Suspects. The sun climbed higher over St. Mary Mead, chasing away the morning chill, but the village felt heavy, like a blanket of worry had settled over it. Reverend Clement's murder was all anyone could talk about, and whispers buzzed from the bakery to the post office. Miss Jane Marple walked down the high street, her black hat steady despite the breeze, her eyes sharp behind her gentle smile. She headed for the Blue Boar Inn, the best place to hear village talk. Her mind was already sorting through what she'd seen in the vestry, the letter opener, the fingerprint, the scuff mark, the mysterious list. Each was a piece of a puzzle, and she needed more to make it whole. The Blue Boar was a cozy pub with low beams and a crackling fire, even in spring. Its windows were small, letting in just enough light to make the wooden tables glow. The air smelled of fresh bread and ale, and the hum of voices filled the room. Miss Marple stepped inside, nodding to Mrs. Baker, the innkeeper who was wiping glasses behind the counter. The regulars were there, farmers, shopkeepers, and a few old ladies like herself, sipping tea and sharing news. Today, though, the chatter was louder, the faces tighter. She chose a corner table near the fire where she could hear without being noticed. Her knitting bag rested at her feet, but she didn't touch it. Instead, she ordered a pot of tea and a scone, her ears open like a fox's. The villagers didn't disappoint. Reverend Clement's death was a spark, and their words were the fire. "He was stabbed right in the church," said Mr. Tompkins, the butcher, his voice low but carrying. "Locked in, they say, with no way out. Who'd do such a thing to a man of God?" "Maybe someone he crossed," replied Mrs. Dane, who ran the bakery. "I heard he argued with Mr. Hargreaves last week over the organ fund, shouting loud enough to wake the dead." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind filing away the detail. Mr. Hargreaves, the churchwarden, was a gruff man with a temper, always fussing about money. She pictured him in his tweed jacket, his face red as he waved his arms. Could he have been angry enough to kill? She doubted it. Hargreaves was loud, not sneaky, but anger could make people do strange things. Across the room, Miss Lavinia Gray sat with her usual group, the church ladies who planned every fete and flower show. Her thin face was pale, her hands clutching a handkerchief. "It's a sin," she said, her voice sharp. "Reverend Clement was a saint. Whoever did this will burn for it." "Oh, Lavinia, don't be so dramatic," said Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, who'd joined the group despite her red eyes. "He was good, but he wasn't perfect. He had his secrets, like anyone." Miss Marple's cup paused halfway to her lips. Secrets. Mrs. Price's words were casual, but they carried weight. What did she know about the Reverend? Miss Marple made a mental note to talk to her later, somewhere quieter. Mrs. Price was shaken, but she wasn't foolish. If Reverend Clement had a secret, she might have seen it. The door swung open, and young Tommy Pierce slunk in, his cap pulled low. He was a skinny boy, no more than 14, with freckles and a knack for trouble. He'd been caught stealing from the collection plate last month, and Reverend Clement had given him a stern talk but no punishment. Tommy headed for the counter, ordering a lemonade, but his eyes darted around like he was afraid of being seen. "Bet it was that Pierce boy," muttered Mr. Tompkins, loud enough for Tommy to hear. "Always sneaking about, that one. Probably stabbed the Reverend for a handful of coins." Tommy's face went red, and he gripped his glass tight. "I didn't do nothing," he snapped, his voice cracking. "I liked the Reverend. He was kind to me." "Then where were you this morning?" Mrs. Dane asked, her arms crossed. "Weren't at the church, were you?" Tommy mumbled something and turned away, his shoulders hunched. Miss Marple watched him, her heart softening. He was scared, not guilty. Boys like Tommy acted tough, but they broke easily under pressure. Still, his absence from the church was curious. Where had he been when Mrs. Price found the body? She leaned back, letting the voices wash over her. The villagers were quick to point fingers, but their guesses were wild, built on gossip more than fact. Mr. Hargreaves, Miss Gray, Tommy Pierce. They were the obvious suspects, the ones everyone named. But Miss Marple knew murder wasn't always obvious. Sometimes it hid in plain sight, behind a smile or a kind word. Her thoughts drifted to Reverend Clement's sermons. He'd always spoken of love and forgiveness, his voice warm and steady. But lately, she'd noticed a change. His words had grown heavier, his eyes distant, as if carrying a burden. Last Sunday, he'd paused mid-sentence, staring at the congregation like he saw something troubling. What had he been thinking? Had he known someone wished him harm? She finished her scone, brushing crumbs from her skirt. The Blue Boar was getting crowded now, and the talk was turning to other things. Crops, weather, the upcoming fete. Miss Marple paid her bill and stepped outside, the fresh air clearing her head. The high street was busy, with children running past and carts rattling over the cobblestones. She decided to visit the church again, not to see the vestry, that was locked tight now, but to feel the place, to think where Reverend Clement had spent his final moments. The church was quieter now, the police wagons gone. A single constable stood by the gate, looking bored. Miss Marple nodded to him and slipped inside, her shoes soft on the stone floor. The nave was empty, the air cool and still. She sat in a pew near the front, her hands folded in her lap, and let her mind wander. The vestry was a locked room, Craddock had said. Door locked, key in the Reverend's pocket, window latched. It sounded impossible, but Miss Marple knew nothing was impossible if you looked closely enough. The fingerprint on the window bothered her. Craddock thought it was old, but she wasn't sure. If someone had climbed through, they'd have needed to be quick, quiet, and familiar with the church. Tommy Pierce came to mind. He'd admitted to sneaking through that window once to fetch a ball. Could he have done it again? She shook her head. Tommy was a thief, not a killer. Then there was the list in the wooden box with Miss Gray's name circled in red. What did it mean? Debts? Promises or something darker? Miss Gray was a proud woman, always at church, always organizing. She'd been hurt when Reverend Clement rejected her fate plans. But murder? It seemed far-fetched. Still, pride could twist a heart, and Miss Gray's was strong. Mr. Hargreaves was another piece of the puzzle. His argument with the Reverend was no secret. Half the village had heard it. Money was a powerful motive, but Hargreaves was practical, not violent. If he'd killed, it would have been in a fit of rage, not a planned attack with a letter opener. And how would he have locked the door from inside? Miss Marple's eyes moved to the altar, where a vase of daffodils stood, their yellow petals, bright against the white cloth. Mrs. Price had brought those flowers, she'd said, just before finding the body. Miss Marple frowned. Mrs. Price had been shaken, but she'd stayed calm enough to fetch help. And that comment about the Reverend's secrets? What had she meant? Was it just grief talking or something more? She stood, her knees creaking, and walked to the vestry door. It was locked now, a heavy padlock gleaming in the dim light. She didn't need to go inside. The scene was burned in her mind. The letter opener, the chipped cup, the scuff mark, the open Bible. Each detail was a thread, and she'd weave them together, given time. As she left the church, she saw Miss Gray across the green, heading toward the vicarage. Her steps were quick, her head down. Miss Marple watched her, curious. Was she visiting Mrs. Clement, offering comfort, or something else? She made a note to call on Miss Gray tomorrow, maybe over tea. People talked more when they felt at ease. The village was settling down now, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows. Miss Marple walked home, her cottage a welcome sight with its roses and tidy path. Inside, she lit the fire and set the kettle on, her mind still turning. She took out her knitting, the pink shawl soft under her fingers, but she didn't knit. Instead, she sat by the window, watching the village fade into dusk. St. Mary Mead was her home, its people her family. She knew their quirks, Mr. Hargreaves's bluster, Miss Gray's pride, Tommy's mischief. But she also knew their pain, their fears, their hidden corners. Someone here had killed Reverend Clement, and that someone was watching, waiting, hoping to stay hidden. Miss Marple's lips tightened. They wouldn't stay hidden long. She thought of the Reverend's last sermon, his voice faltering as he spoke of forgiveness. Had he been reaching out to his killer, offering a chance to confess? Or had he been warning them, stirring a fear that led to his death? The list in the box nagged at her. Why was Miss Gray's name circled? And what about the fingerprint, the scuff, the chipped cup? They were clues, small but sharp, like needles in her knitting. The kettle whistled, and she poured her tea, the steam warm on her face. She'd talk to Mrs. Price tomorrow, maybe Tommy too, and she'd keep an eye on Mr. Hargreaves and Miss Gray. The village was talking, and talk was her best tool. People let things slip when they thought no one was listening. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes on the darkening sky. Reverend Clement had been her friend, a light in St. Mary Mead. His death was a wound, but she'd heal it, not with tears, but with truth. Somewhere in the village, a killer was hiding, and she'd find them one quiet word at a time. Chapter 4: A Crisis of Faith. The evening settled over St. Mary Mead like a soft blanket, the sky turning deep blue as stars began to peek out. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlor fire, the glow casting shadows on the walls of her cozy cottage. The room was warm, filled with the familiar comforts of her life. The cushioned armchair, the bookshelf crammed with novels, the teapot steaming on the table. Her knitting lay untouched in its basket, the pink shawl forgotten for now. Her hands rested in her lap, but her mind was far from still, churning through the day's events like a river over stones. Reverend Clement's murder had shaken the village, but it had shaken Miss Marple more than she cared to admit. He'd been more than a vicar to her. He'd been a friend, a steady voice of kindness in a world that often felt unsteady. His sermons had always lifted her, reminding her of the good in people, the hope that faith could bring. Now he was gone, struck down in the church he loved, and the loss felt like a crack in her heart. She stared into the fire, the flames dancing in her sharp blue eyes. The vestry scene replayed in her mind, the letter opener in his chest, the blood on his collar, the open Bible, the smudged fingerprint on the window, the locked door, the scuff mark, the chipped cup, the list with Miss Gray's name circled. In red, they were all pieces of a puzzle, but they didn't yet fit. She'd been solving puzzles her whole life, watching the villagers of St. Mary Mead, noticing their secrets. But this one was different. This one hurt. Miss Marple opened her Bible, the leather cover worn from years of use. She turned to Psalms, hoping the words would soothe her, but they blurred before her eyes. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." She closed the book, her fingers trembling. How could a man like Reverend Clement, who lived for God and goodness, meet such a violent end? It wasn't just a crime. It felt like a betrayal, as if the world she trusted had turned upside down. She thought back to a conversation with the Reverend just a week ago. They'd sat in her garden, sipping tea under the rose trellis, the air sweet with blooms. He'd been quieter than usual, his smile tinged with worry. "Jane," he'd said, his voice low, "sometimes I wonder if I've failed this village. There's a darkness here I can't reach." She'd pressed him gently, but he'd shaken his head, changing the subject to her roses. Now, those words echoed in her mind, heavy with meaning. What darkness had he seen? Had it been the shadow of his own killer? The fire popped, sending a spark onto the hearth. Miss Marple leaned forward, brushing it away with the poker. Her faith had always been her anchor, a quiet strength that carried her through life's storms. She believed in goodness, in justice, in the idea that truth would always rise to the surface. But tonight that faith felt fragile, like a thread stretched too thin. If a man as good as Reverend Clement could be murdered in his own church, what did that say about the world? About God? She stood, her knees creaking, and walked to the window. The village was dark now, the cottages lit by soft glows from their windows. St. Mary Mead looked peaceful, but she knew better. Somewhere out there was a killer, hiding among neighbors, friends, people she'd known for years. The thought made her shiver, not from cold, but from the weight of it all. Her mind turned to the suspects the village was buzzing about. Mr. Hargreaves, the churchwarden, with his loud voice and quick temper. He'd argued with the Reverend over money, but was that enough to kill? Miss Lavinia Gray, the spinster who lived for the church, her pride bruised when her fate plans were dismissed. Could her devotion have twisted into something darker? And young Tommy Pierce, the choir boy caught stealing, his eyes always darting like he was hiding something. None of them felt right, but Miss Marple knew feelings weren't facts. She needed evidence, and she needed to understand why. She returned to her chair, picking up her tea, though it had gone cold. The Blue Boar's gossip had given her names, but it was Mrs. Price's words that stuck with her. He had his secrets, like anyone. What secrets? Mrs. Price had been close to the Reverend, not just as his wife's friend, but as someone who worked beside him in the church. If anyone knew what troubled him, it was her. Miss Marple decided to visit her tomorrow, maybe with a basket of scones to loosen her tongue. The list in the vestry's wooden box nagged at her. Why was Miss Gray's name circled? Was it a warning, a debt, or something the Reverend meant to confront? And the fingerprint on the window. Craddock thought it was old, but Miss Marple wasn't convinced. If someone had climbed through, they'd have needed to know the latch was loose, a detail only a regular at the church might notice. Tommy Pierce had admitted to using that window once, but he was a boy, not a planner. Still, she'd talk to him, see if his story held up. Her thoughts drifted to the chipped cup on the Reverend's desk. It was such a small thing, but it bothered her. Reverend Clement was tidy, his vestry neat as a pin. Why use a damaged cup? Had someone else brought it, or was it a sign of carelessness in his final moments? And the scuff mark on the floor had he moved the chair, or had the killer left it rushing to escape? Each detail was a thread, and she'd weave them together, but it would take time. Miss Marple set her cup down and closed her eyes, letting the fire's warmth sink into her bones. She remembered another case years ago when a farmer's wife had poisoned her husband. Everyone thought it was an accident, but Miss Marple had noticed a jar of jam, its seal broken too soon. It was always the little things, the ones people overlooked, that told the truth. This case would be the same. She just had to find the right thread to pull, but tonight it wasn't just the case that weighed on her. It was the question of faith. She'd always believed that good would triumph, that evil would be found out. But Reverend Clement's death made her wonder. If a man of God could be struck down, what did that mean for her beliefs? She opened her Bible again, flipping to John. In the world ye shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. The words were a comfort, but they didn't erase the ache. She thought of the village, its people going about their lives. They'd gossip and grieve, but they'd also heal because that's what people did. Miss Marple wanted to heal too, but first, she needed answers. She needed to know why Reverend Clement died, not just for justice, but for herself. His death had shaken her faith, and solving this murder was the only way to steady it again. The clock on the mantel chimed 9, its soft bells pulling her from her thoughts. She stood tidying the parlor out of habit, though it was already spotless. Tomorrow she'd start digging. She'd visit Mrs. Price, talk to Tommy, maybe even Mr. Hargreaves. She'd listen to the village because St. Mary Mead always talked, and talk revealed secrets. But tonight, she needed rest, even if sleep felt far away. She climbed the narrow stairs to her bedroom, the cottage creaking around her like an old friend. Her room was simple, a single bed with a quilt her mother had made, a dresser with a mirror, a window overlooking the garden. She changed into her nightgown, her movements slow but steady, and knelt by the bed to pray. Her words were quiet, a whisper between her and God. Help me see the truth, she said. For Reverend Clement, for the village, for me. She climbed into bed, pulling the quilt to her chin. The night was still, the village silent beyond her window, but her mind wouldn't rest. She saw the vestry again, the blood, the the Bible, the list. She saw Reverend Clement's face, peaceful in death, and heard his voice heavy with worry. "There's a darkness here I can't reach." Miss Marple closed her eyes, willing sleep to come. She'd faced darkness before, cheats, liars, even killers. Each time she'd found the light, the truth that set things right. This time would be no different, she told herself. But as she drifted off, a small part of her wondered if this darkness was deeper, if it would test her in ways she hadn't faced before. The fire downstairs burned low, its embers glowing in the dark. Outside, St. Mary Mead slept, its secrets tucked away in quiet cottages. Somewhere a killer was hiding, thinking they'd won. But Miss Marple was watching, her mind sharp, her heart determined. She'd find them, not just for justice, but to mend the crack in her faith, to prove that, even in the darkest moments, truth could still shine. Chapter 5. The Hidden Letter. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow on the village's stone cottages and winding lanes. Miss Jane Marple woke early, her sleep restless with thoughts of Reverend Clement's murder. The crack in her faith still ached, but she pushed it aside, determined to find answers. Her cozy bedroom, with its quilted bed and rose-patterned curtains, felt like a safe haven. But the world outside was anything but safe. She dressed in her usual sensible skirt and blouse, pinned her white hair into a neat bun, and tied on her black hat. Today she'd visit the vicarage to see Mrs. Clement, the Reverend's widow. If anyone knew what secrets he'd carried, it was her. Miss Marple stepped into her parlor, where the fire had burned to ashes overnight. She set a kettle on the stove and toasted a slice of bread, her mind already sorting through the clues from the vestry, the letter opener, the fingerprint, the chipped cup, the scuff mark, the list with Miss Gray's name circled. Each was a thread in a tangled web, and she needed more to unravel it. The village was buzzing with suspects, Mr. Hargreaves, Miss Gray, Tommy Pierce, but none felt quite right. The Reverend's death was personal, not a random act, and Miss Marple was sure the key lay in something he'd known, something he'd hidden. She ate her toast with a smear of jam, sipping tea as she planned her day. Mrs. Clement would be grieving, but grief often loosened tongues. Miss Marple packed a small basket with scones from yesterday's baking, a kind gesture to ease her way into the vicarage. She added a jar of her homemade raspberry jam, knowing Mrs. Clement had a sweet tooth. With her basket on her arm, she locked the cottage and set off, her step steady despite the weight in her heart. The vicarage was a short walk just past the church, its ivy-covered walls peeking over a low hedge. The garden was tidy with daffodils nodding in the breeze, but the house looked somber, its curtains drawn. Miss Marple knocked softly, and the door opened to reveal Mrs. Clement, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She wore a black dress, simple but neat, and her dark hair was pulled back tightly. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice thin. "How kind of you to come. Please come in." The vicarage parlor was warm, with a fire crackling and a tray of tea things on the table. Photos lined the mantel, Reverend Clement smiling at a church fete, the couple on their wedding day, a young girl who must have been their daughter, now grown and living far away. Mrs. Clement motioned to a chair, and Miss Marple sat, setting, her basket on the floor. "I brought some scones," she said gently, "and a bit of jam. I thought you might need a little comfort." Mrs. Clement's lips trembled. "You're so kind. It's been so hard. I keep expecting him to walk through the door calling for his tea." She turned away, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. Miss Marple nodded, her heart aching for the woman's pain. "I know, dear. It's a terrible loss. I've been thinking of him, of how much he meant to us all. He was such a good man." "He was," Mrs. Clement whispered. "Too good, maybe. He always saw the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it." Miss Marple's ears pricked at the words. Did he ever talk about anyone troubling him? Someone he was trying to help? Mrs. Clement hesitated, her fingers twisting the handkerchief. Not really. He was private about his work, but lately he was different, quiet, like something was weighing on him. I asked, but he'd just smile and say it was nothing. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft. Anything you remember, even something small, might help. The police are looking, but you knew him best. Mrs. Clement sighed, staring into the fire. There was one thing. A few days ago, he was writing a letter. He sealed it and tucked it away, said it was for a friend. I didn't think much of it. He was always writing to people, encouraging them. But he looked so serious, like it was important. A letter? Miss Marple's mind sparked. Do you know who it was for? No, Mrs. Clement said. He didn't say, but he kept it in his desk, in the study. I haven't looked. I couldn't bear to touch his things yet. Would. You mind if I did? Miss Marple asked, keeping her tone gentle. It might tell us something about what happened. Mrs. Clement nodded slowly. I suppose it's all right. The police have already been through, but they didn't take much. Come with me. She led Miss Marple to a small study at the back of the house, a room lined with books and smelling of leather and ink. The desk was cluttered with papers, a Bible, and a worn pen. Mrs. Clement opened a drawer, her hand shaking, and stepped back. It's all here, just as he left it. Miss Marple approached the desk, her eyes scanning the surface. She didn't want to disturb anything, but she was careful, using her handkerchief to lift papers. There were sermon notes, a church budget, a thank you note from a parishioner. Then, tucked beneath a stack of envelopes, she found it. A sealed envelope addressed in the Reverend's neat handwriting to, My dear friend. Her heart quickened. May I open this? She asked, holding it up. Mrs. Clement bit her lip, but nodded. If it helps find who did this, yes. Miss Marple slit the envelope with a letter opener from the desk, careful not to tear the paper. Inside was a single sheet, folded once. She unfolded it and read the words, her breath catching. I know your secret. Meet me in the vestry at 8 p.m. I pray we can find peace. The note was undated, unsigned, but it was clearly Reverend Clement's writing. Miss Marple read it again, her mind racing. A secret? A meeting? This was no ordinary letter. It was a confrontation. A plea. Maybe. A warning. Had the Reverend written it to his killer? And if so, who was my dear friend? Mrs. Clement, she said, keeping her voice calm. Do you have any idea who this might be for? Mrs. Clement took the note, her eyes scanning the words. Her face paled further and she shook her head. No, he never spoke of secrets, but he was so distant these last weeks. I thought it was just the church, the pressure of it all. Now I wonder. Miss Marple tucked the note into her handbag, promising to show it to Inspector Craddock. You've been very brave, dear, she said. This could be important. Try to rest now. Mrs. Clement nodded, tears spilling over. I just want to know why. Why him? I'll find out, Miss Marple promised, her voice firm. For both of you. She left the vicarage, the note burning a hole in her thoughts. The village was awake now, children playing on the green, carts rattling down the lane. She walked slowly, letting the fresh air clear her mind. The note changed everything. Reverend Clement had known something dangerous enough to get him killed. But what? And who? Her mind flicked to the suspects. Mr. Hargreaves, with his temper and money disputes, didn't seem the type to be called my dear friend. Miss Gray, with her pride and devotion, might fit, especially with her name circled on that list. But the note's tone was gentle, not accusing, and Miss Gray was anything but gentle when crossed. Tommy Pierce? He was a boy, not someone the Reverend would write to like this. Or was he? She thought of the vestry again, the locked door, the fingerprint, the scuff mark. The note suggested a planned meeting, but the locked door meant the killer had either been let in or found another way. The window, with its loose latch and smudged print, was still her best guess. Someone had climbed through, killed the reverend, and locked the door to make it look impossible. But who knew the vestry well enough to pull it off? Miss Marple reached, the church, its tower casting a long shadow across the green. The constable was gone, but the doors were locked, a sign of the village's new caution. She didn't need to go inside. The vestry was vivid in her memory. Instead, she sat on a bench by the churchyard, watching the village go by. Mrs. Dane waved from the bakery, her apron dusted with flour. Mr. Tompkins, the butcher, was chatting with a farmer, their voices low. Life went on, but the murder hung over everything, like a storm cloud waiting to break. She took out the note again, reading it under the sunlight. I know your secret. What secret? Money, love, betrayal? Reverend Clement had been a shepherd to his flock, but shepherds sometimes saw things their sheep wanted hidden. Had he stumbled on a sin too big to ignore? And why the vestry? Why 8 p.m.? It was a private place, a quiet time, perfect for a secret talk or a trap. Her thoughts turned to Mrs. Price's words at the Blue Boar. He had his secrets, like anyone. Mrs. Price had been close to the Reverend, helping with church duties. Had she seen something? Heard something? Miss Marple decided to talk to her next, maybe tomorrow. And Tommy Pierce. She'd find him too, ask where he'd been that morning. Boys like Tommy noticed things, even if they didn't know it. The list in the vestry box came back to her. Miss Gray's name, circled in red, felt like a warning, but the note didn't seem to fit her. Was there a connection, or was she chasing shadows? And the chipped cup, the scuff mark, small things, but they nagged at her. The Reverend was tidy, careful. A chipped cup wasn't his style, and a scuff, mark meant movement, maybe a struggle, though Craddock saw none. Miss Marple stood, brushing her skirt. The village was her puzzle, its people the pieces. She'd listen, watch, ask quiet questions. The note was a clue, a big one, but it wasn't enough. She needed more talk, more truths, more threads, to weave. She walked home, her basket lighter but her heart heavy. Reverend Clement's death wasn't just a crime, it was a wound, and she'd heal it by finding the truth. Back in her cottage, she lit the fire and set the kettle on. The note stayed in her handbag, safe for now. She'd show it to Craddock, but not yet. First, she'd think, let the village talk, let the pieces settle. As the fire warmed the parlor, she sat with her tea, her eyes on the flames. Somewhere, in St. Mary Mead, a killer was hiding, thinking they'd won. But Miss Marple was watching, and she never gave up. For Reverend Clement, for her faith, for justice, she'd keep going, one careful step at a time. Chapter 6. The Fingerprint Clue. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in soft oranges and pinks. Miss Jane Marple walked along the lane, her black hat steady against the breeze, her mind sharp as ever. Reverend. Clement's murder weighed heavy on her heart, but the hidden letter she'd found at the vicarage had lit a spark. I know your secret. Meet me in the vestry at 8 p.m. The words echoed in her thoughts, a clue that pointed to a secret worth killing for. She was determined to unravel it, not just for justice, but to mend the crack in her faith that the Reverend's death had left behind. Her morning had been busy. After leaving the vicarage, she'd stopped by the post office to mail a letter to her nephew, but really to listen to the village chatter. The murder was still the only topic, with fingers pointing at Mr. Hargreaves, Miss Gray, and young Tommy Pierce. Miss Marple didn't join the gossip, but she soaked it up, sifting through the rumors for truth. Now she was headed back to the church, not to enter the locked vestry, but to check something that nagged at her. The window with the smudged fingerprint. The church stood quiet, its stone tower casting a long shadow across the green. The police had come and gone, leaving only a faint chalk mark where their wagons had parked. Miss Marple approached the side of the building, where the vestry's narrow window sat just above a flower bed. The ground was soft from yesterday's rain, and she noticed faint impressions, nothing clear but enough to suggest someone had stood there recently. She crouched, careful not to disturb the soil, her eyes tracing the window's frame. The latch was old, rusted, and loose, just as she'd remembered. She didn't touch it. Inspector Craddock would have scolded her, but she studied the smudge on the glass. The fingerprint was still there, faint but clear, a partial curve with delicate ridges. Craddock had said it was likely old, left by a cleaner or a choir boy months ago. But Miss Marple wasn't convinced. The smudge looked fresh, its edges sharp, not dulled by dust or time. If someone had climbed through this window, they could have killed the Reverend, locked the door from inside, and slipped out again, leaving the room a puzzle. She stood, brushing her hands on her skirt, and thought of the letter. The Reverend had planned a meeting at 8 p.m., a time when the church was empty, the village settling for the night. Whoever he'd written to, his dear friend, had come, but not for peace. The letter opener, the blood, the locked door, it, all pointed to a quick, desperate act. But the window was the key. It was the only way in and out without a key, and that fingerprint was her best clue. Miss Marple walked to the village green, where children played near the duck pond, their laughter, a sharp contrast to her heavy thoughts. She spotted Tommy Pierce sitting on a bench, tossing pebbles into the water. His cap was pulled low, his shoulders hunched, like he was trying to disappear. The village had been hard on him, whispering that he was a thief, maybe worse. Miss Marple approached, her smile kind but her eyes watchful. "Hello, Tommy," she said, sitting beside him. "Mind if I join you?" He glanced up, his freckled face wary. "Suppose not, Miss Marple. But I ain't done nothing, if that's what you're here for." "I believe you," she said gently. "But I need your help. You know the church. Better than most, don't you? Sweeping the steps, helping with the choir?" Tommy shrugged, tossing another pebble. "Yeah, I guess. Reverend Clement was nice to me, even after, the collection plate." Miss Marple nodded, her voice soft. "You told me you climbed through the vestry window once to get a ball. Was that hard to do?" He squinted at her, suspicious. "Why are you asking? You think I killed him?" "No, Tommy," she said firmly. "I think you're a good boy who notices things. I'm trying to figure out who hurt the Reverend, and that window might be important. Could someone climb through it without making a fuss?" Tommy relaxed a little, his fingers fiddling with a pebble. "It's not hard. The latch is wobbly. Push it, and it opens. Window's small, but I fit easy, and I ain't big. Someone else could too if they knew how. I only did it that one time, though, I swear." "I know," she said, patting his hand. "Did you ever see anyone else near that window? Maybe someone hanging around the church at night?" He thought for a moment, his brow furrowing. "Not really, but sometimes I'd see Miss Gray walking by the churchyard late, after everyone's gone. She'd look at the windows like she was checking something. I thought it was weird, but she's always at church, so I didn't say nothing." "Miss Gray?" Miss Marple's mind sparked. The spinster's name kept coming up, circled on the Reverend's list, now this. Was she watching the church for a reason, or was it just her usual fussiness? "Thank you, Tommy," she said. "You've been a big help. If you think of anything else, come tell me, all right?" He nodded, a shy smile breaking through. "Okay, Miss Marple. I liked the Reverend. I want whoever did this caught." She left him to his pebbles, her thoughts racing. Tommy's story about the window fit her theory. The killer had climbed through, killed the Reverend, and locked the door to make it look impossible. The fingerprint was likely theirs, left in a moment of carelessness. But Miss Gray's late-night walks were a new piece, one that didn't quite fit. Was she involved, or just a nosy villager? Miss Marple headed to the Blue Boar Inn, needing a place to think and listen. The pub was quieter than yesterday, with only a few regulars nursing their drinks. Mrs. Baker, the innkeeper, waved her to a corner table, bringing a pot of tea without being asked. Miss Marple settled in, her eyes on the room, her ears open. The murder was still the talk, but the names hadn't changed. Hargreaves, Gray, Tommy. No one mentioned the letter, which meant Craddock was keeping it quiet, just as she was. She sipped her tea, thinking of the fingerprint. Craddock had promised to check it, but she hadn't heard back. She'd visit him later, see if it matched anyone, or no one. A stranger seemed unlikely. This felt like a village crime, born of secrets only a local would know. The letter's words, "I know your secret," pointed to someone close, someone the Reverend trusted enough to call dear friend. Her mind drifted to the vestry's other clues. The chipped cup bothered her, out of place in the Reverend's tidy world. Had he used it? Or had the killer brought it? The scuff mark on the floor suggested movement, maybe a chair pushed back, in a hurry. And the list, with Miss Gray's name circled. Why? Was it connected to the letter, or something else entirely? A voice broke her thoughts. "Miss Marple, fancy seeing you here." It was Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, carrying a basket of vegetables from the market. Her face was still pale, but she managed to smile. "Mrs. Price, dear," Miss Marple said, motioning to the chair across from her. "Join me for a moment?" Mrs. Price sat, setting her basket down. "I'm just trying to keep busy. The village is so quiet, but it feels wrong with him gone." Miss Marple nodded, her voice gentle. "I've been thinking of Reverend Clement. You said he had secrets like anyone. Did he ever mention anything troubling him? Something he couldn't share?" Mrs. Price hesitated, her fingers tightening on her basket. "Not exactly, but he was worried, I could tell. A few weeks ago, he asked me to pray for someone in the village, someone struggling. He didn't say who, just that they needed guidance. I thought it was just his way, caring for everyone." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Did he say anything else? Maybe about a meeting or a letter?" Mrs. Price shook her head. "No, nothing like that. But he was in the vestry a lot lately, writing, praying. I'd see the light on late when I passed by on my way home." Another late-night clue, Miss Marple thought. The Reverend in the vestry, Miss Gray near the churchyard. Were they connected? She thanked Mrs. Price, who hurried off to her errands, and finished her tea, her mind buzzing. The fingerprint, the window, the letter, they were all pointing to a careful plan, but the killer had left traces, small mistakes that would undo them. She left the Blue Boar and walked to the police station, a small building near the village hall. Inspector Craddock was there, his desk piled with papers, his face tired but focused. He looked up as she entered, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Miss Marple," he said, leaning back. "I knew you'd show up sooner or later. Got any new theories?" She smiled, pulling the letter from her handbag. "I found this at the vicarage, with Mrs. Clement's permission. It's in the Reverend's hand. I think you'll find it interesting." Craddock took the note, his eyes scanning the words. His eyebrows shot up. "I know your secret." "This is big, Miss Marple. Why didn't you bring it sooner?" Chapter 7. The Confrontation. The late afternoon sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a warm glow, but a chill lingered in Miss Jane Marple's heart. Reverend Clement's murder had left a shadow over the village, and the clues she'd gathered, the letter, the fingerprint, the chipped cup, the scuff mark, the list with Miss Gray's name, were pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. The hidden letter, with its cryptic plea, "I know your secret. Meet me in the vestry at 8 p.m., pointed to a secret worth killing for, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it. Her faith, shaken by the Reverend's death, drove her to seek truth, not just for justice, but to heal the wound in her soul. She sat in her cozy parlor, the fire crackling softly, her knitting untouched. The village was buzzing with gossip, and she needed to hear more, to see how the suspects reacted to the idea of a secret. She decided to invite them to tea at her cottage, a gentle trap to watch their faces, catch their slips. Mr. Hargreaves, Miss Gray, Tommy Pierce, and, if she could manage it, Mrs. Clement. They'd all come, if only to avoid looking suspicious. Tea was her weapon, loosening tongues and revealing truths. Miss Marple set to work, baking a batch of scones and pulling out her best china. Her cottage was small but welcoming, with lace curtains letting in soft light and a table set with a crisp white cloth. She arranged the scones, a pot of jam, and a plate of biscuits, knowing food made people feel safe, ready to talk. She wrote quick notes to her guests, asking them to come at 4 o'clock, saying she wanted to share memories of Reverend Clement. It was true enough, but her real goal was to stir the pot, see who flinched. By 3, the cottage was ready, the kettle steaming and the fire warm. Miss Marple smoothed her skirt, pinned her white hair neatly, and waited. Her mind replayed the clues. The letter suggested a planned meeting, the fingerprint hinted at the window as the killer's path, the scuff mark showed movement, the chipped cup didn't fit the Reverend's tidy habits. The list with Miss Gray's name circled was a nagging question, and Tommy's story about her late-night walks near the church added a twist. Mrs. Price's comment about the Reverend's secrets lingered too. Somewhere in this web was the truth, and Miss Marple was ready to pull the right thread. The first to arrive was Mr. Hargreaves, the church warden, his tweed jacket wrinkled and his face red from the walk. He was a big man with a loud voice and a temper, known for arguing with the Reverend over church funds. "Miss Marple," he said, wiping his brow. "Kind of you to invite me, but I'm not one for tea parties." "Nonsense," she said, guiding him to a chair. "It's just a little gathering to remember our friend. Sit, have a scone." He grunted but took a seat, grabbing a scone and slathering it with jam. Miss Marple watched him, noting his quick glances at the door. Nervous, she thought, but was it guilt or just his usual grumpiness? Next came Miss Lavinia Gray, her thin frame wrapped in a gray shawl, her lips tight. She was a spinster who lived for the church. Her pride stung when the Reverend rejected her. Fate plans. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice sharp, "I hope this isn't about gossip. The village is bad enough." "Not at all, dear," Miss Marple said, offering her a biscuit. "We're here to honor Reverend Clement. Tea?" Miss Gray nodded, sitting stiffly, her eyes darting to Hargreaves. There was no love lost between them, Miss Marple knew. They'd clashed over church matters before, and the tension was clear. Tommy. Pierce arrived next, his cap twisted in his hands, his freckled face wary. The choir boy had been caught stealing from the collection plate, but the Reverend had been kind, giving him a second chance. "Didn't know why you asked me, Miss Marple," he mumbled, hovering by the door. "You're part of the church, Tommy," she said kindly. "Come sit, have some jam." He shuffled to a chair, grabbing a biscuit and avoiding everyone's eyes. Miss Marple noted his discomfort. Scared, she thought. But of what? Being blamed, or something more? Mrs. Clement was late, arriving just as the clock struck 4. Her black dress hung loosely, her face pale with grief. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I wasn't sure I could come. It's so hard." "You're here now, dear," Miss Marple said, guiding her to a chair. "Let's share some memories of your husband." She poured tea, the china clinking softly, and passed around the scones. The room was quiet at first, the guests sipping and nibbling, their eyes on each other. Miss Marple let the silence grow, knowing it would push someone to speak. It was Hargreaves who broke it, his voice loud in the small room. "Terrible thing, what happened?" he said, crumbs on his jacket. "Reverend was a good man, even if we didn't always see eye to eye. Who'd do such a thing?" Miss Gray's lips tightened. "Someone with no soul," she said. "Stabbing him in the church. It's a sin beyond forgiveness." Tommy shifted in his seat, his biscuit untouched. "He was nice to me," he said quietly. "Didn't yell when I messed up." Mrs. Clement stared at her tea, tears brimming. "He cared for everyone," she whispered, "even those who didn't deserve it." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes moving from face to face. Now was the moment. She set her cup down, her voice gentle but clear. "I've been thinking about Reverend Clement," she said. "He was a man who saw people's hearts, their secrets. I heard he wrote a letter asking someone to meet him in the vestry, something about a secret he knew." The room went still. Hargreaves froze, his scone halfway to his mouth. Miss Gray's hand shook, spilling tea on her saucer. Tommy's eyes widened, and Mrs. Clement's cup clattered, her face white. Miss Marple watched them all, her heart steady despite the tension. She hadn't said much, just enough to stir the pot, and their reactions were telling. "A letter?" Hargreaves said, his voice too loud. "What kind of nonsense is that? Probably just church business." "Maybe," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. But it sounded important, something he felt he had to face. Miss Gray's lips pursed. If he knew a secret, he should have gone to the police, not played hero. Secrets are dangerous. Tommy looked confused, his cap twisting tighter in his hands. "I don't know nothing about letters," he said. "I just swept the steps. Mrs. Clement's hands trembled, her tea untouched. He never told me about any letter," she said, her voice breaking. But he was troubled. "He said he'd failed someone he cared about." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Failed someone? That echoed the Reverend's words to her. "There's a darkness here I can't reach." She leaned forward, her eyes on Mrs. Clement. "Did he say who, dear? Even a hint might help." Mrs. Clement shook her head, tears falling. "No, he wouldn't tell me. He just prayed a lot late at night. I thought it was his work, but now—" The room fell quiet again, the fire's crackle the only sound. Miss Marple let the moment stretch, watching their faces. Hargreaves was flushed, his eyes avoiding hers. Miss Gray fidgeted, her handkerchief crumpled in her fist. Tommy looked lost, like a boy caught in a grown-up fight. Mrs. Clement was the most shaken, her grief raw but her words sharp with meaning. Had she known more than she said? Miss Marple poured more tea, her hands steady. "It's hard to lose someone so good," she said. "But I believe Reverend Clement would want us to find the truth, to bring peace to the village." Hargreaves grunted. "Police'll handle it. No need for us to poke around." Miss Gray nodded. "The inspector knows his job. We should focus on the church, keep things going." Tommy said nothing, his eyes on the floor. Mrs. Clement wiped her tears, her voice soft. "I just want to know why. Why him?" Miss Marple smiled, her voice warm. "We'll find out, dear. Together." The tea went on, the conversation turning to safer things, memories of the Reverend's sermons, his kindness at fates. But Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, cataloging every look, every word. Hargreaves's bluster hid something, fear maybe, or just discomfort. Miss Gray's sharpness felt forced, like she was guarding a secret. Tommy's confusion seemed genuine, but his silence was heavy. And Mrs. Clement, her trembling hands, her talk of failure, pointed to a truth she might not fully know. As the guests left, the sun dipping low, Miss Marple tidied the parlor, her thoughts racing. The letter had shaken them all, but Mrs. Clement's reaction was the strongest. Had the Reverend confided in her, even a little? And Miss Gray's fidgeting, did it tie to her name on the list, her late-night walks? The fingerprint, the window, the scuff mark, they all pointed to a careful killer, but one who'd made mistakes. She sat by the fire, the cottage quiet now, and thought of the vestry. The chipped cup still bothered her, out of place in the Reverend's neat world. The scuff mark suggested a struggle, or at least movement. The list, the letter, the fingerprint. They were all connected, she was sure. But how? And why had the Reverend felt he'd failed someone? Was it the killer or someone else? Miss Marple stood, lighting a lamp as the room darkened. She'd talk to Craddock tomorrow, share what she'd seen, ask about the fingerprint again. She'd also visit Miss Gray, maybe Tommy, probe their stories. The village was her puzzle, its people her pieces, and she'd keep turning them until they fit. As she climbed the stairs to bed, the night silent outside, she felt a spark of hope. The tea had stirred things up, and the killer was out there feeling the pressure. Her faith, bruised by the Reverend's death, was still there, pushing her forward. She knelt by her bed, her prayer simple. "Show me the way, for him, for us." She slipped under the quilt, the cottage creaking softly. The truth was close. She could feel it. like a thread ready to be pulled. Tomorrow, she'd keep going, watching, listening, until the killer's mask slipped. For Reverend Clement, for Saint Mary Mead, for her own heart, she'd find the light in the darkness, one quiet step at a time. Chapter 8. The Truth Revealed. The evening sky over St. Mary Mead was a deep velvet blue, dotted with stars that blinked like tiny promises. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, the fire casting a warm glow across the lace curtains and polished table. Her knitting lay untouched, the pink shawl forgotten as her mind worked through the clues of Reverend Clement's murder. The tea at her cottage had stirred the village pot, and the reactions of Mr. Hargreaves, Miss Gray, Tommy Pierce, and Mrs. Clement had given her plenty to chew on. The hidden letter, "I know your secret. Meet me in the vestry at 8 p.m., was the key, pointing to a secret so heavy it led to murder. Tonight she'd piece it together, not just for justice, but to mend the crack in her faith. The tea had been a test, and Mrs. Clement's trembling hands, her talk of the Reverend's failure, stood out. Hargreaves had blustered, Miss Gray had fidgeted, and Tommy had looked lost, but Mrs. Clement's grief carried a weight that felt like truth. Miss Marple's heart ached for her, but her mind was sharp, connecting the dots. The letter, the fingerprint. On the window, the chipped cup, the scuff mark, the list with Miss Gray's name circled. They all pointed to a killer who'd planned carefully but left mistakes, and Miss Marple was ready to follow those mistakes to the end. She stood, smoothing her skirt, and lit a lamp to chase away the shadows. The village was quiet, but she knew Inspector Craddock was still at the church, combing through evidence. She decided to join him, to share her theory and see if the final pieces fell into place. She grabbed her coat and hat, her steps steady despite the late hour, and walked through the darkened lanes to the church. The air was cool, scented with spring flowers, but a chill ran through her, not from the night, but from the weight of what she suspected. The church loomed ahead, its stone walls silvered by moonlight. A single police wagon was parked outside, and a constable nodded as she approached. Inside, the nave was dim, the stained glass windows dark without the sun. Miss Marple found Craddock in the vestry, his notebook open, a lantern casting harsh shadows across the room. The desk was bare now, the Reverend's body gone to the coroner, but the bloodstain lingered, a grim reminder. "Miss Marple," Craddock said, looking up with a mix of surprise and amusement. "Out late, aren't you? Got another hunch?" She smiled, setting her handbag on a chair. "More than a hunch, Inspector. I think I know who killed Reverend Clement and how. Will you hear me out?" He leaned back, crossing his arms. "Always do, don't I? Go on, then." Miss Marple took a breath, her voice calm but firm. "The vestry was a locked room, you said, with the key in the Reverend's pocket and the window latched. But the window's latch is loose, and the fingerprint we found wasn't old. It was fresh, left by the killer. They climbed through, killed him, locked the door from inside, and slipped out the same way, latching the window to make it look impossible." Craddock nodded, his eyes narrowing. "We've been over the window. No match on the print yet, but I'm listening," she continued, her thoughts clear as glass. "The letter I found at the vicarage was the key. Reverend Clement wrote to someone. He called my dear friend, asking them to meet him at 8 p.m. because he knew their secret. He wasn't accusing, he was offering a chance to confess, to find peace. But the person he wrote to didn't want peace. They came to the vestry, and they killed him." Craddock flipped open his notebook. "Who's this dear friend, then? Hargreaves? Gray? The Pierce boy?" Miss Marple's lips tightened. "None of them. It was Mrs. Clement." Craddock's eyebrows shot up. "The Reverend's widow? That's a leap, Miss Marple. She's been grieving, barely holding together. Why her?" Miss Marple stepped to the window, her fingers brushing the latch through her handkerchief. "Mrs. Clement was close to the Reverend, closer than anyone. She helped with church duties, knew his habits, his secrets. At tea today, she said he felt he'd failed someone he cared about. I think he meant her. The secret he knew was hers, and it was eating him alive." Craddock frowned, scribbling in his notebook. "What secret? And why kill him?" She loved him. Miss Marple turned, her eyes sharp in the lantern light. Money, she said simply. The church funds were short, weren't they? You mentioned it when we first spoke. I think Mrs. Clement was taking from the collection plate small amounts at first to cover debts, gambling perhaps, or something she was ashamed of. The Reverend noticed, maybe through that list we found with names of people he was watching. He confronted her, not with anger, but with love, hoping to help. That's why he wrote the letter, why he asked her to meet him. Craddock leaned forward, his voice skeptical. Gambling? That's a stretch. And the letter opener. The locked room. Miss Marple nodded, pacing the small room. The letter opener was on the desk, a spur-of-the-moment choice. She came to the vestry, maybe to confess, but when he pressed her, she panicked. She grabbed the opener and stabbed him, a single blow, no struggle. She knew the vestry well. She'd been there countless times. She climbed out the window, latched it from outside and locked the door with the key she took from his pocket, then slipped the key back later when no one was looking. Craddock rubbed his chin. The fingerprint, though. We checked hers. It didn't match. Did you? Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but pointed. Or did you assume it wasn't hers because she's the widow? She could have worn gloves but slipped one off for a moment, leaving the print. And the chipped cup. It wasn't the Reverend's. He was tidy, never used damaged things. She brought it, maybe to share tea, to keep things calm before the talk turned serious. Craddock's eyes widened. The cup. I didn't think of that. And the scuff mark? The chair, Miss Marple said. She pushed it back as she stood, maybe in a hurry after the deed. It wasn't a struggle, just a moment of panic. Everything fits, Inspector, if you look at her. He sat back, his face troubled. It's a theory, I'll give you that. But we need proof, a confession or evidence. Miss Marple reached into her handbag, pulling out the letter. Start with this. Search her rooms at the vicarage. Look for a ledger, maybe, or signs of debt. Check her gloves for blood or traces of the window's rust. She's grieving, yes, but it's not just for him. It's for what she's done. Craddock took the letter, his expression grim. You're sure about this, Miss Marple? If you're wrong, it'll break her. I'm sure, she said softly. And if I'm right, it'll bring peace to the village, and to him. Craddock stood, tucking the letter into his pocket. I'll get a warrant. We'll search tonight. Want to come along? Miss Marple shook her head. No, Inspector, this is your work now. I'll be at home waiting. She left the church, the night air cool on her face. The village was asleep, its cottages dark, but her mind was alive, piecing together the final threads. Mrs. Clement had been the dear friend, the one the Reverend trusted, the one he'd failed to save. Her secret, money, shame, desperation, had driven her to a moment of madness, and the Reverend had paid the price. Miss Marple walked home, her cottage a warm light in the darkness. She lit the fire, set the kettle on, and sat with her tea, the silence comforting. The clues had come together, not with a flash, but with the quiet certainty of truth. The fingerprint, the letter, the cup, the scuff, they all pointed to Mrs. Clement, a woman broken by her own choices. An hour later, a knock came at her door. It was Craddock, his face weary but resolute. You were right, he said, stepping inside. We searched the vicarage. Found a ledger hidden in her sewing box, church funds, siphoned off for months, paid to a man in the next town. Gambling debts, like you said, and a glove, stained with blood, tucked in a drawer. We showed her the letter, and she broke down. Confessed everything. Miss Marple's heart sank, even as she nodded. What did she say? Craddock sat, his hat in his hands. She said she didn't mean to kill him. She'd been taking money, small amounts, to cover bets she couldn't stop. The Reverend figured it out, wrote the letter to help her confess. They met in the vestry, and he was kind but firm. Said she had to tell the church, make it right. She panicked, grabbed the letter opener, and it was over in a second. She climbed out the window, locked the door, and slipped the key back when she found the body with Mrs. Price. Miss Marple closed her eyes, picturing the scene.
"Poor woman," she whispered, "and poor Reverend Clement."
Craddock nodded. "She's at the station now, sobbing her heart out. Says she's sorry, but it's too late for that." Miss Marple poured him tea, her hands steady despite the ache in her chest. "It's never too late for forgiveness," she said. He'd have wanted that even now. Craddock sipped his tea, his eyes on the fire. "You've got a knack, Miss Marple. I'd have missed her, focused on Hargreaves or Gray." "How'd you know?" She smiled, a sad, quiet smile. "I know people, Inspector. Their hearts, their fears. Mrs. Clement was hurting, and hurt people do desperate things. The clues were there. The letter, the cup, the print. They told the story if you listened." He stood, tipping his hat. "Well, you listened better than me. The village owes you." She shook her head. "The village owes the Reverend. I just did what he'd have wanted. Found the truth." Craddock left, and Miss Marple sat by the fire, the cottage silent. The case was solved, but the weight of it lingered. Mrs. Clement, a woman she'd known for years, had killed out of fear and shame. It was a tragedy, not a triumph, and it stung her faith even as it steadied it. The Reverend had seen the darkness, tried to reach it, and paid with his life. But the truth was out, and that was something. She thought of the vestry, the clues that had led her here. The fingerprint, a careless slip. The letter, a plea for redemption. The cup, a sign of a visitor. The scuff, a moment of panic. They'd all pointed to Mrs. Clement, a woman trapped by her own mistakes. Miss Marple's heart ached for her, but justice was justice, and the village would heal. She stood, tidying the parlor out of habit, and climbed the stairs to bed. The night was still, the stars bright through her window. She knelt, her prayer simple. Thank you for the truth. Help her find peace. As she slipped under the quilt, the cottage creaking softly, Miss Marple felt a quiet strength. The crack in her faith wasn't gone, but it was smaller now, held together by the truth she'd found. The killer was caught. The Reverend's memory, honored. Tomorrow, she'd face the village, its shock, its grief. But tonight, she'd rest, knowing she'd done what she could. For Reverend Clement, for St. Mary Mead, for herself, she'd brought light to the darkness, one careful step at a time.
Chapter 9. Restoring Faith. The morning sun rose gently over St. Mary Mead, its rays slipping through the mist to touch the village's stone cottages and winding lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, a cup of tea cooling on the table, her
knitting untouched. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the lace curtains, but her heart was heavy with the weight of yesterday's truth. Mrs. Clement, the Reverend's widow, had confessed to his murder, driven by shame and desperation over stolen church funds. The case was solved, the killer caught, but the victory felt hollow. Reverend Clement's death had shaken Miss Marple's faith, and though the truth had steadied it, the wound lingered, a quiet ache she couldn't ignore. The village was reeling too. News of Mrs. Clement's arrest had spread like wildfire, whispered in the bakery, the post office, the Blue Boar Inn. Mr. Hargreaves, Miss Gray, Tommy Pierce, they'd all been suspects in the village's eyes, but no one had suspected the grieving widow. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her sharp blue eyes on the window where sparrows flitted in her rose garden. She'd solved the puzzle, the letter, the fingerprint, the chipped cup, the scuff mark. But it wasn't joy she felt. It was sorrow, for a woman broken by her own choices, for a reverend who died trying to save her, for a village that would never be quite the same. She thought back to the vestry, where it all began. The letter opener in the reverend's chest, the blood on his collar, the open Bible, the smudged window. The clues had led her to Mrs. Clement, whose gambling debts and stolen money had pushed her to a moment of madness. The letter, "I know your secret. Meet me in the vestry at 8 p.m." had been the Reverend's attempt to help, not accuse, but fear had turned it deadly. Miss Marple's faith had wavered, questioning how a man of God could meet such an end, but finding the truth had brought a flicker of light, a reminder that justice, however painful, was part of the world's balance. Today was the Reverend's memorial service, a chance for the village to grieve together. Miss Marple dressed carefully, choosing a black dress and her simple hat with a single feather. She wanted to honor her friend, to hear his life celebrated, not his death mourned. She packed a small basket with scones, a habit of kindness, and set out for the church, her steps steady despite the weight in her chest. The village was quiet, the usual bustle muted. Children played on the green, but their laughter was softer, as if they felt the sorrow in the air. Mrs. Dane waved from the bakery, her face tight with shock. Mr. Tompkins, the butcher, stood outside his shop, shaking his head as he spoke to a farmer. The news of Mrs. Clement's confession had stunned them all, and Miss Marple could feel their eyes on her as she passed. They knew she'd helped Craddock, though not how. She kept her head high, her smile gentle, letting them wonder. The church stood at the heart of St. Mary Mead, its stone tower gleaming in the sunlight. The doors were open, and villagers filed in, their faces somber. Miss Marple slipped inside, the air cool and heavy with the scent of candles and flowers. The pews were filling with familiar faces. Miss Gray, her shawl tight around her shoulders, Mr. Hargreaves, his temper subdued, Tommy Pierce, his cap in his hands, looking small and lost. Mrs. Price was there too, arranging daffodils on the altar, her eyes red but her hands steady. Miss Marple took a seat near the front, her basket at her feet. The organ played softly, a hymn the Reverend had loved, its notes filling the nave with a quiet hope. She looked at the altar, where a portrait of Reverend Clement stood, his kind eyes seeming to watch over them. Her heart ached, but she felt a spark of strength. He'd been a light in the village, and though he was gone, his goodness lingered. In the people he'd touched, the faith he'd shared. The new vicar, a young man with a gentle voice, stepped to the pulpit. His name was Reverend Harper, sent from a nearby parish to fill the gap. He was nervous, his hands gripping the lectern, but his words were steady. "We gather to honor Reverend Clement," he began, "a man who lived for love, for forgiveness, for redemption. His life was a gift, and though his death was a tragedy, his spirit is with us, guiding us to heal." Miss Marple listened, her hands folded in her lap. The word redemption struck her. That's what the Reverend had offered Mrs. Clement, a chance to redeem herself, to confess her theft and start again. Instead, she'd chosen fear, and it had cost them both. Yet the new vicar's words stirred something in her, a reminder that faith wasn't about a perfect world, but about finding light in the dark. Her faith, bruised by the murder, felt a little stronger, the crack a little smaller. Reverend Harper spoke of the Reverend's kindness, his sermons that lifted hearts, his quiet visits to the sick and lonely. Villagers nodded, some wiping tears. Miss Gray clutched her prayer book, her lips moving silently. Mr. Hargreaves stared at the floor, his usual bluster gone. Tommy fidgeted, but his eyes were on the portrait, full of a boy's regret. Miss Marple watched them, her mind calm but alert. The village was grieving, but it was also coming together, and that was a start. The service ended with a hymn, "Abide with Me," its melody soaring through the church. Miss Marple sang softly, her voice blending with the others, and felt a weight lift. The Reverend's death had shaken her, made her question the goodness she'd always trusted. But here in the church, with the village united, she saw that goodness wasn't gone. Evil existed. Mrs. Clement's act proved that, but so did love and faith and the will to move forward. After the service, the villagers gathered in the churchyard, sharing memories over tea and biscuits. Miss Marple stayed, passing out her scones, listening to the talk. Mrs. Price thanked her, her voice thick. "He'd have loved this," she said, gesturing to the crowd. "Everyone together remembering him?" "He would," Miss Marple agreed, her smile warm. "He always believed in us." Miss Gray approached, her face less sharp than usual. "Miss Marple," she said, "I heard you helped the police. I'm glad the truth came out, even if it hurts." Miss Marple nodded, noting the softness in her tone. Miss Gray had been a suspect, Her name circled on the Reverend's list, her late-night walks suspicious. But now, Miss Marple saw her for what she was, a proud woman, devoted to the church, who'd been hurt, but not guilty. "Truth is the best medicine," she said gently, "even when it stings." Mr. Hargreaves joined them, his voice gruff but kind. "Didn't think it was her," he said. "Thought it was that Pierce boy or maybe me, the way folks talked. You've got a sharp eye, Miss Marple." She smiled, deflecting the praise. "I just listen, Mr. Hargreaves. The village tells its own story." Tommy lingered nearby, kicking at the grass. Miss Marple called him over, offering a scone. "You did well, Tommy," she said quietly. "Telling me about the window helped more than you know." He blushed, taking the scone. "Didn't do much. Just glad it's over." "It's not over," she said, her voice soft. "But it's better. Keep being good, Tommy." He nodded, a shy smile breaking through, and ran off to join the other boys. Miss Marple watched him go, her heart lighter. The village was healing slowly, and so was she. She decided to visit Mrs. Clement at the police station, a final step to close the case in her heart. The station was a short walk, its brick walls plain but solid. Inside, Craddock met her, his face tired but kind. "She's in a cell," he said, leading her down a narrow hall. "Not sure she'll want to see you, but you can try." Mrs. Clement sat on a cot, her black dress crumpled, her face pale and streaked with tears. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, her eyes wide with shame. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "why are you here? To judge me?" "No, dear," Miss Marple said, sitting across from her. "To listen, and to pray." Mrs. Clement's lips trembled. "I didn't mean to hurt him. I loved him. But the money? I couldn't stop. He knew, and he was so kind, but I was so scared. When he said I had to tell the church, I just lost myself." Miss Marple nodded, her heart aching, but her voice steady. "I know, and he'd forgive you, even now. You'll face justice, but you can still find peace." Mrs. Clement sobbed, her hands covering her face. "How? After what I did?" Miss Marple reached out, her touch gentle. "By being honest, by asking for forgiveness from him, from God, from yourself." She took a small prayer book from her handbag, one the Reverend had given her years ago, and pressed it into Mrs. Clement's hands. "Read this when you're ready. He'd want you to." Mrs. Clement clutched the book, tears falling. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't deserve it." Miss Marple stood, her eyes soft. "None of us do, dear. That's what grace is for." She left the station, the evening air cool on her face. The village was settling into dusk, lights glowing in cottage windows. She walked home, her steps slower now, the weight of the day easing. The memorial had lifted her, the village's unity, a reminder of the goodness she'd doubted. Mrs. Clement's confession, her pain, was a tragedy, but it was also a chance for redemption, even if it came slowly. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple lit the fire and set the kettle on. She sat with her tea, the parlor warm and quiet, and thought of the Reverend. His death had been a shock, a blow to her faith, but solving his murder had shown her that faith wasn't about a perfect world. It was about facing the dark, finding the truth, and holding on to hope. The crack in her heart was still there, but it was healing, held together by the work she'd done, the light she'd found. She opened her Bible, the pages worn from years of use, and read from Psalms. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." The words settled over her, a balm for her soul. Reverend Clement was gone, but his legacy lived in the village, in her, in the truth she'd uncovered. As the fire burned low, Miss Marple felt a quiet peace. The case was closed, the village on its way to healing. Tomorrow she'd bake more scones, visit Mrs. Price, listen to the village's stories. But tonight, she'd rest, knowing she'd honored her friend. For Reverend Clement, For St. Mary Mead, for her faith, she'd faced the darkness and found the light, one careful step at a time. Chapter 10. The Village Moves On. Summer bloomed over St. Mary Mead, wrapping the village in a blanket of warmth and color. The fields were green, the roses in full glory, and the air hummed with bees and the scent of cut grass. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, a straw hat shading her face, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on the pink shawl she'd neglected during the dark days of Reverend Clement's murder. The case was solved. The killer, Mrs. Clement, confessed and arrested. But the memory lingered, a quiet scar on the village and on Miss Marple's heart. Her faith, shaken by the Reverend's death, had steadied through the truth she'd uncovered, and now, in the soft light of summer, she felt a gentle peace. Her cottage was as tidy as ever, its stone path lined with flowers, its parlor cozy with lace curtains and a well-stocked bookshelf. The fire was unlit today, the windows open to let in the breeze. Miss Marple sipped lemonade, a rare treat, and watched the village come alive. Children ran across the green, their laughter bright, chasing a ball or skipping stones by the duck pond. Mrs. Dane swept the bakery steps, waving to passers-by. Mr. Tompkins, the butcher, hung fresh cuts in his shop window, his whistle carrying down the lane. Life was returning to St. Mary Mead, stitching itself back together after the tear of tragedy. The memorial service for Reverend Clement had been a turning point, a moment for the village to grieve and heal. Miss Marple had felt it then, the flicker of hope in the church, the new vicar's words about redemption, the villagers' unity as they sang, "Abide with me." Her visit to Mrs. Clement in the police station, offering a prayer book and a chance for forgiveness, had closed the case in her heart. The Reverend's death had been a wound, but the truth, hard as it was, had been the first step toward mending it. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the clues that had led her to the truth. The letter opener in the Reverend's chest, the fingerprint on the vestry window, the chipped cup, the scuff mark, the hidden letter. "I know your secret. Meet me in the vestry at 8 p.m. Each had been a thread, and she'd woven them together, revealing Mrs. Clement's desperate act. The widow had stolen church funds to cover gambling debts, and when the Reverend confronted her, offering redemption, fear had driven her to kill. It was a tragedy, not a triumph, but it was justice, and it had steadied Miss Marple's faith, reminding her that even in darkness, truth could shine. The village had been shocked, the gossip fierce at first. Mr. Hargreaves, Miss Gray, and Tommy. Pierce, once suspects, were cleared, their names no longer whispered with suspicion. Hargreaves had softened, his temper quieter, even helping organize the church fete. Miss Gray, her pride bruised but intact, had taken charge of the flower rota, her sharp edges smoothed by the village's need to heal. Tommy, the choir boy, was back to sweeping the church steps, his mischief tempered by the Reverend's memory. Miss Marple smiled, thinking of them. People were flawed, but they were resilient, and St. Mary Mead was proof of that. She set her knitting down, adjusting her hat as a breeze stirred the roses. The church bell rang, calling the village to Sunday service. And she decided to go, not out of duty, but because she wanted to feel the Reverend's presence in the place he'd loved. She gathered her prayer book and a light shawl, locking the cottage behind her. The lane was busy now, families walking to church, their voices mingling with the bell's chime. Miss Marple joined them, nodding to Mrs. Price, who carried a basket of daffodils for the altar. The church was full, its stone walls cool against the summer heat. The stained glass windows glowed, casting red, blue, and gold across the pews. Reverend Harper, the new vicar, stood at the pulpit, his young face earnest as he welcomed the congregation. Miss Marple took a pew near the back, her eyes moving. Over the familiar faces, Miss Gray, her prayer book open, Hargreaves, his hat on his knee, Tommy in the choir loft, his voice clear in the opening hymn. The air was warm with candlelight and the scent of flowers, and for the first time in weeks, Miss Marple felt at home. Reverend Harper's sermon was simple, about hope and renewal, drawing from the story of the prodigal son. "We all stray," he said, his voice steady, "but there's always a way back, through love, through truth." Miss Marple listened, her heart lifting. The words echoed what she'd told Mrs. Clement in the cell, that forgiveness was possible even after the worst mistakes. The Reverend's death had tested her faith, made her question the goodness she'd trusted, but solving his murder had shown her that faith wasn't about a perfect world. It was about facing the dark, finding the light, and carrying on. The service ended with a hymn, Amazing Grace, its melody soaring through the church. Miss Marple sang softly, her voice blending with the others, and felt the crack in her faith heal a little more. The Reverend was gone, but his spirit lived in the village, in the people he'd touched, in the truth she'd fought for. As the congregation filed out, she lingered, her eyes on the altar, where the daffodils glowed like small suns. She whispered a prayer for Reverend Clement, for Mrs. Clement, for St. Mary Mead. Outside, the churchyard was alive with chatter, villagers, sharing tea and biscuits under the old oak. Miss Marple joined them, passing out the last of her scones, her smile warm. Mrs. Price hugged her, her eyes bright. "You've done so much," she said. "The village is healing thanks to you." Miss Marple shook her head, deflecting the praise. "We all did it, dear. Together." Miss Gray approached, her shawl neat, her face softer than usual. "Miss Marple," she said, "I misjudged you. I thought you were just nosy. But you brought us peace." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "I'm nosy enough, Miss Gray, but I listen, that's all." Hargreaves lumbered over, his voice gruff but kind. "Oh, you one, Miss Marple. Thought I'd be in the clink the way folks talked. You said it right." "Justice sets itself right," she said, offering him a biscuit. "We just help it along." Tommy ran up, his cap crooked, a grin on his face. "Miss Marple, I sang loud today like the Reverend liked. Did you hear?" "I did," she said, patting his shoulder. "He'd be proud, Tommy." The boy beamed, and dashed off, joining the other children. Miss Marple watched him, her heart light. The village was moving on, not forgetting the Reverend, but honoring him by living, by laughing, by coming together. She felt it in herself, too. A quiet strength, a faith tempered by pain but stronger for it. She walked home, the sun high now, the village green buzzing with life. Her cottage welcomed her with its familiar comforts, the roses, the stone path, the open windows letting in the summer breeze. Inside, she set the kettle on and took out her knitting, the pink shawl soft under her fingers. She sat by the window, the needles clicking, and let her thoughts settle. The case had been hard, the hardest she'd faced. The clues, the letter, the fingerprint, the cup, the scuff, had been small, but they'd told a big story. Mrs. Clement's confession, her tears in the cell, had been a tragedy, not a victory. Yet it was the truth, and the truth had set the village free, even if it hurt. Miss Marple had seen darkness in the murder, in the betrayal, in her own doubts. But she'd also seen light in the village's resilience, in the new vicars, hope in her own stubborn will to find answers. Her faith, once shaken, was intact, not the same as before, but deeper, more real. She'd questioned God, the world, herself, when the Reverend died. But solving his murder had shown her that faith wasn't about easy answers. It was about walking through the valley, as the psalm said, and coming out stronger. She opened her Bible, the pages worn from years of use, and read from John. "The light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not." The words were a comfort, a reminder that even in the worst moments goodness endured. The kettle whistled, and she poured her tea, the steam warm on her face. Outside, the children's laughter carried through the window, a sound of life, of hope. She thought of Reverend Clement, his kind eyes, his gentle voice. He'd seen the darkness in Mrs. Clement, tried to reach it, and paid with his life. But his love had lingered in the village, in her, in the truth she'd found. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes on the garden, where a butterfly danced among the roses. The village was her home, its people her family. She knew their quirks, Hargreaves's, Temper, Miss Gray's pride, Tommy's mischief. She knew their pain, too, their fears, their hidden corners. They'd faced a storm, but they'd come through, and so had she. She set her cup down, picking up her knitting again. The shawl was nearly done, its soft pink a promise of brighter days. She thought of the future, the church fete, the harvest festival, the small joys of St. Mary Mead. There'd be more puzzles, she knew. People were people, and secrets always bubbled up. But she'd be ready, her sharp mind and quiet heart watching, listening, finding the truth. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in pinks and golds, Miss Marple felt a quiet joy. The crack in her faith was nearly gone, healed by the work she'd done, the love she'd seen. She'd faced evil and found good, not perfect, but real. She looked at the church tower just visible over the rooftops and smiled. There's always a puzzle to solve, she thought, and always a reason to hope. She stood, tidying the parlor out of habit, and lit a lamp as the room darkened. The village was settling into evening, its lights glowing like stars. She climbed the stairs to bed, the cottage creaking softly, and knelt for her prayer. Thank you for the light, for him, for us. Under the quilt, with the summer breeze whispering through the window, Miss Marple closed her eyes. The Reverend's memory was safe, the village strong, her faith whole. Tomorrow she'd bake scones, walk the lanes, listen to the villages, stories. But tonight she'd rest, knowing she'd done what mattered. For Reverend Clement, for St. Mary Mead, for herself, she'd found the truth, and it had set her free.